Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal as the pale glow of dawn crept slowly through the antique windowpanes of the Quartermain estate, a silence, so familiar and serene in its stillness, was shattered in an instant by the gut-wrenching scream of a mother in despair. The echo of Sasha's voice cut through the halls like shattered glass, sharp and irreversible. Moments earlier, she had entered the nursery expecting to see the gentle rise and fall of her infant daughter's chest in the crib, the promise of life nestled safely beneath soft blankets. Instead, she found only emptiness. The cradle was bare, and the cold realization dropped into her chest like a stone, plunging her into a darkness more terrifying than any trauma she had ever endured before. Daisy was gone. And with her disappearance came the haunting echo of Sasha's past. The ghosts of children lost, of griefs barely healed, now summoned anew by a loss too immediate to process. Sasha staggered out of the nursery, the world spinning around her as she collided with Michael, who was just turning the corner. Her mouth opened, but no words came. Her expression said it all. Within seconds, the alarm was raised, and the walls of the Quartermain mansion, usually stoic and composed, erupted in chaos. The police were summoned, the staff questioned, and every room in the estate was turned upside down in a frantic search for the missing infant. Fear gripped every soul inside that house. The unspoken question echoed like a drumbeat in every heart: who could have taken Daisy? Suspicion fell almost immediately upon Sidwell. He was no stranger to cruelty or calculated vengeance. With a history of animosity toward Holly and knowledge of Daisy's existence, it wasn't far-fetched to imagine he might orchestrate something like this to send a message, one that would strike at the very heart of those who had wronged him. Some speculated he had hired someone to do his dirty work. Others believed he was lurking in the shadows, watching everything unfold like a puppet master. Yet even amid that fear and paranoia, another unsettling possibility began to rise to the surface, quiet but persistent. What if it wasn't Sidwell? What if the real threat had been hiding in plain sight? Olivia, trying to keep her voice steady, confided in Michael her growing concern over Sasha's mental state. She had noticed changes, disjointed speech, flashes of confusion, an edge of desperation behind her eyes. Was it possible, she asked, that Sasha herself had done something to Daisy in a fugue of postpartum despair? Chase, ever the cautious investigator, began to consider this theory seriously. He suggested surveillance, discretion, and subtle observation. No one wanted to accuse Sasha outright, but the possibility of a psychological breakdown couldn't be ignored. And yet, behind the curtain of chaos and mounting panic, no one had noticed the silent movements of a woman who had once known that nursery like the back of her hand. Willow. The name itself evoked sympathy, a woman shattered by loss, driven to the edge after the devastating courtroom verdict that stripped her of custody of Wiley and Amelia. A woman betrayed by the man she once loved, alienated by the woman who now held his child, discarded by the very family she had once belonged to. No one thought her capable of harm, of cruelty, of vengeance. But they were wrong. In the earliest hours of that morning, while Sasha had still been fast asleep, Willow had walked the hallway barefoot, her presence a whisper against the floorboards. Her eyes were not wild, but strangely serene, almost devout. She opened the door to the nursery and stood there for a long moment, watching the infant breathe, the tiny chest rising and falling like waves against a distant shore. She crossed the room, lifted Daisy into her arms, and murmured words that no one else would hear, words of sorrow, betrayal, and twisted justification. In her fractured mind, this wasn't a kidnapping. It was a reclamation of dignity, a rebalancing of justice. If the world had denied her the right to be a mother, she would teach that world the meaning of loss. She didn't flee far. Willow walked only to the edge of the property, to the overgrown garden where shadows still lingered from nights long past. She sat with Daisy, cradling the child in her arms, whispering lullabies born of both love and madness. Her heart ached, but her mind had made peace with what she had done. Only when the cries of the household reached the garden did she stir again. Not with panic, but with methodical resolve. She re-entered the estate without anyone noticing. She laid Daisy gently in a second cradle in the seldom-used parlor, far from the nursery where the search was concentrated. Then she retraced her steps, wiping down the original crib with surgical precision. Her time living at the Quartermain mansion had taught her many things, including how to access the security system. Within minutes, she erased footage from the hallway cams, deleted messages from her phone, and locked away every trace of her presence in that nursery. When Olivia eventually discovered Daisy lying quietly in the parlor, Willow was already seated nearby, hands folded, face pale, posture subdued like a bystander in prayer. Sasha rushed in moments later, her voice trembling, tears streaming down her cheeks. But now, instead of seeing a grieving mother, many eyes watched her with uncertainty. Had she imagined the disappearance? Had she lost her grip on reality? Michael exchanged a long look with Olivia, who shook her head gravely. Chase noted the contradiction in timelines and behavior but said nothing for now. Only Willow sat silently, her heart pounding beneath a mask of serenity, her secret buried deep behind vacant eyes. She had almost gone through with it. At the garden's edge, she had considered disappearing with Daisy forever. But in the final moment, it had been the child's cry, not of fear, but of need, that broke something inside her. That small, primal sound reminded her of Wiley's first cries, of Amelia's smile, of everything she had lost. And so she returned, not to make things right, but to hide the evidence of how wrong things had already become. By the time evening fell over Port Charles, the incident was already being reclassified by authorities. A misunderstanding. A brief moment of panic. Perhaps even a mother's hallucination, born of exhaustion. Sasha was encouraged to rest. Michael assured her everything would be fine. But beneath the surface of their reassurances, a silent fracture was widening. Jason, ever watchful, wasn't convinced. He'd seen too many people fall through the cracks of sanity to dismiss the bizarre circumstances. Something didn't add up. That night, as Willow sat in her dimly lit bedroom staring at a photograph of Wiley and Amelia, she didn't cry. She didn't smile either. Her expression was unreadable, empty, hollowed out by grief and vengeance. Somewhere inside her, something had shifted irreversibly. She was no longer just the woman who had lost her children. She was the woman who could make others feel what she had felt. And in her twisted sense of righteousness, that made her powerful. That made her necessary. No one knew what she had done. No one suspected. Not yet. But in the days to come, as Daisy slept safely in her crib and Sasha tried to convince the world she wasn't delusional, the truth would simmer just beneath the surface, waiting to erupt. And Willow, hidden in plain sight, would be there to watch it all burn. No one could have imagined that just a few hours earlier, in a fleeting but dangerously impulsive moment, Willow had nearly crossed a line from which there would have been no return. She had wrapped Daisy in a soft, pale yellow blanket, her hands trembling not from guilt, but from the fevered adrenaline of a plan fueled by years of invisible pain. Her feet carried her instinctively through the back corridor of the Quartermain mansion, then out the kitchen door, and across the dew-soaked grass of the estate's sprawling garden. The early morning fog was still clinging low to the earth, curling around her ankles like ghosts, as she made her way toward the edge of the property, the weathered wooden fence that marked the final boundary between civilization and wilderness. Just beyond that fence lay a narrow trail, obscured by wild ivy and shadow trees, a forgotten path that led deep into the woods behind Port Charles. Willow had paused there, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the gnarled trees beyond, imagining 100 different futures. In one of them, she and Daisy disappeared forever. In another, she would raise the child in secret, give her a new name, a new story, and tell her that the world had been cruel to both of them, but they had survived. In that fragile moment, Willow felt a twisted sense of triumph. She had taken back control. She had stolen from Michael the very thing he had stolen from her. This, she told herself, was not madness. It was justice. But then, in that suspended silence between decision and action, Daisy cried. It was a short, instinctive sound, one that would have been easy to ignore if Willow had been further gone, if her heart had been completely numb. But it wasn't. That tiny wail, a helpless, trembling note from a child who sensed something wasn't right, pierced through the fog of Willow's fractured psyche. It reached the remnants of the mother she used to be, the one who had once held Wiley through his night terrors, who had sung lullabies to Amelia while silently weeping from exhaustion and love. The cry shattered the illusion. For a single second, clarity returned. Willow froze. Her knees buckled slightly, and her arms clutched Daisy closer, not in defiance, but in grief. She wasn't ready to admit it aloud, but something had broken inside her. She couldn't go through with it. Not yet. Not like this. She turned around slowly, still shaking, retracing her steps like a ghost haunting her own regrets. By the time she returned to the mansion, the chaos had only just begun. She entered through the side door unnoticed, placed Daisy in a rarely used cradle in the formal parlor, wiped away any traces of her fingerprints, and fled to her car as if nothing had happened. Minutes later, she arrived at Metro Court, where Nina was already looking around with confusion and mild irritation. Willow offered a smile too wide and a breathless explanation about traffic on the bypass. Nina tilted her head skeptically, there had been no reports of congestion, and raised an eyebrow. Still, she let it go. After all, Willow had been through so much. Perhaps she simply needed a moment to breathe. But beneath Willow's carefully practiced exterior, a storm churned. While she made polite conversation, her mind drifted, flashes of memory intruding like shards of glass. She saw herself walking down the hall of the mansion, Daisy nestled against her chest. She remembered the smug satisfaction that pulsed in her veins like a victory parade as she whispered to the sleeping infant that justice had finally been served. She saw her own tear-streaked face reflected in the nursery window, a face contorted not with guilt, but with rage. She had been Michael's wife once, had shared his dreams, his name, his children. And now, she was a stranger, exiled from the very life she had helped build. No one could understand the torment of watching Sasha cradle the baby that might have been hers, of watching Nina fawn over Daisy while she, the real mother in spirit if not by blood, sat on the outside looking in. Willow's internal monologue was interrupted when she noticed Jason standing by the bar, his gaze fixed on her with quiet calculation. She quickly looked away, feigning interest in the wine list. She knew Jason's intuition was dangerous. He was the one person in Port Charles who could see through lies no matter how perfectly woven. And indeed, elsewhere in town, the unanswered questions had begun to echo louder. Back at the Quartermain estate, Sasha had collapsed into Michael's arms the moment Daisy was found. Olivia, watching from the doorway, approached with caution and suggested gently that perhaps Sasha had simply missed the parlor in her panic. The house was large, she reasoned, and maternal trauma could cloud the clearest memories. Michael nodded slowly, but there was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. Something didn't add up. Sasha insisted repeatedly that she had searched the entire first floor, including the parlor. Her voice quivered not with hysteria, but with certainty. Michael wanted to believe her. He needed to. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Chase, though outwardly calm, had already begun compiling an incident report. While officially dismissing the disappearance as a misunderstanding, he made a quiet note to request surveillance footage from the interior cameras. But when the tech team attempted to retrieve the data, they discovered something deeply unsettling. The footage from the main hallway, the nursery corridor, and the east wing entry had all been wiped clean. Not corrupted. Not glitched. Deliberately erased. No backup. No trace. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through Chase's core. He didn't share the detail immediately, not wanting to incite panic or suspicion without evidence. But he called Jason later that evening. Told him that something about this case felt off. That the data erasure wasn't the work of a careless tech or a system error, it was intentional. And it had been done by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Jason listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each word. He thought of Willow. The way she'd smiled at him that morning, faintly too serene. The way her hands had trembled just slightly when she sipped her coffee. He remembered the look in her eyes not long after the custody verdict, when everything she'd believed about justice and motherhood had been torn away from her. He had seen people walk into darkness before, seen it consume the best of them. And now, something deep inside him told him that the person responsible for Daisy's disappearance might not be an enemy from the outside. It might be someone already inside the fold. Already trusted. Already invisible. And so, as night descended on Port Charles, a false calm settled over the town. Sasha tried to convince herself it was all a mistake. Michael tried to focus on his family. Nina tried to resume business as usual. But Willow. Willow sat in her quiet apartment, a single light flickering above her, staring at the ceiling as Daisy's cry echoed in her memory. A cry that had stopped her this time. But what if next time it didn't? What if the next cry went unheard? What if her sorrow outgrew her restraint? The line had been crossed, even if only briefly. And though no one knew it yet, Port Charles would never be the same again. That night, while the town of Port Charles settled into uneasy slumber, Willow sat alone in the dim quiet of her bedroom, the silence so complete it seemed to breathe alongside her. The only light in the room came from a modest table lamp, casting long, soft shadows across the walls and flickering occasionally as though even the electricity sensed the weight of the moment. Her eyes, distant and glassy, remained fixed on an old framed photograph resting atop the shelf. One that captured a happier time when Wiley and Amelia stood giggling in a sunlit field, their arms wrapped around her waist, their eyes full of innocence, trust, and love. Willow's fingers curled slowly around the edge of her blanket, and her lips parted slightly, trembling with words that refused to take form. There were no prayers tonight. No apologies. Only breathless fragments of thoughts she was too tired or too fractured to say aloud. She didn't regret what she had done, at least, not yet. In the fading echo of her conscience, there was no room for guilt. Not when she viewed her actions not as a breakdown, but as the first calculated move in a larger strategy. A message, carved not in ink or voice, but in fear and confusion. A message sent straight to Michael. She needed him to understand that she was not powerless. That he hadn't broken her completely. That she could still reach into the perfect little life he had rebuilt and shatter it just enough to remind him of what he had taken from her. If she could feel the soul-wrenching agony of losing her children, then so could he. That was justice. That was balance. In her heart, Willow still believed she had been the victim. Of a biased legal system that favored perception over truth, of a family that had chosen to forget her suffering, of a man who had once vowed to love her through anything only to discard her like a liability, and of Nina, who had played the long game so well, winning back a daughter at the cost of Willow's identity and sanity. And then there was Sasha, the final insult. Sasha, with her soft voice and sympathetic smiles, who had stood silently by Michael's side while he made the cruelest decision of all, to sever Willow from the children she had raised, loved, and wept for. Sasha, who had smiled in that courtroom as if compassion could erase betrayal. Daisy had been returned. The crib was full again. The infant safe. But the nightmare had only just begun, and no one yet realized it. Because the chaos that had engulfed the Quartermain estate, the panic that had rippled through the police department, and the suspicion that still hung thick in the air, none of it had been caused by some nameless predator or outsider. It had been born within the very walls they all called home. It had come not from beyond, but from within. From someone who had once been cherished, who had once been seen as a survivor, as a soul in need of saving. But Willow was no longer that woman. Whatever gentleness had once defined her had faded like breath on glass. Slowly, methodically, that version of Willow, the mother who sacrificed, the wife who forgave, the daughter who believed in healing, was eroding. In her place emerged something colder, sharper. A presence unburdened by naivety, stripped of idealism, and carved into something vengeful, deliberate, and terrifying in its quiet precision. She no longer saw herself as needing salvation. Now, she saw herself as the one who would decide who deserved mercy, and who deserved ruin. The most chilling part of it all was not what she had done, but the mask she wore while doing it. In public, she still smiled, softly, convincingly. She still nodded when spoken to, still volunteered for shift changes at the hospital, still dropped off thoughtful little gifts to old friends as if nothing had changed. But behind her eyes, a storm brewed. One that grew darker by the day. Because the truth, now like a hairline fracture in a dam, was spreading. Cracks forming, secrets stirring just beneath the surface. And no one, none of them, had the faintest idea. Jason sensed something, but even he couldn't yet name it. Michael, still riddled with guilt over what he had done to her, mistook the occasional tremor in her voice for residual heartbreak rather than the roar of something more dangerous forming beneath. Nina remained oblivious, clinging to the fantasy of reconciliation and peace. And Sasha, kind-hearted and naive as ever, continued to believe that time and compassion would heal all wounds. But Willow knew better. Some wounds never healed. Some mothers didn't move on. Some grief didn't fade, it calcified, transforming into something heavy and sharp. Something that cut both inward and outward. And she was no longer afraid to bleed.